a record button. And a big thanks again to Becky for volunteering to share this information about interpretation in historic cemeteries. I'm super grateful to have you here.
Thank you so much, Curry. So I'm really excited as well. So this is the new signage that I'm going to talk about tonight has been 15 years in the making. So it's a great relief to have it up and in place at the cemetery. So I just want to start by giving a little bit of history about the cemetery. This isn't a history of the Marshfield Pioneer Cemetery talk, but I think a little bit is important so we have some context for our discussion tonight. So the Marshfield Pioneer Cemetery is really the only late 19th century extant cemetery in the Coos Bay region on the Oregon coast. And it was active from about 1888 until 1921, started by the Independent Order of Oddfellows, who started a lot of cemeteries across the United States and in Oregon in particular. There's about 116 in Oregon. And after 1921, the Oddfellows sort of washed their hands of the cemetery. They actually started a new cemetery also in Coos Bay. And there was a lot of issues with who owns the cemetery, issues that are still reverberating today. And so I'm sure all of these, let's see if my screens are working as they should. I'm sure all of these newspaper articles look very familiar to those of you who have spent time with historic cemeteries. So these are from a multitude of times in the mid-20th century and sort of highlight a common problem with historic cemeteries of who's actually taking care of it. Sometimes the ownership is unclear. Sometimes there's a lot of projects that need to be done and few people who want to take that on. Often as people age, relatives move away, there aren't family descendants in the area. And this is a really common narrative for all of us who work with historic cemeteries. So from about 1921 until I began to work with the cemetery in 2005, this was a common refrain that local groups would get inspired and say, oh, the cemetery is a community eyesore, what can we do? They'd last a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, and they would manage to maybe take a few loads of blackberries out, cut down some branches, clean it up a little bit, but then interest really petered out. And I think the best way to illustrate that sort of the disconnect between the way community members viewed the cemetery and the way I think we should view it is with a little anecdote from 1953. So the cemetery is located adjacent to the local high school. So if you've ever been to Coos Bay and visited Marshfield High School, you would have seen the cemetery next door. And in 1953, the school district wanted to expand. And they looked next door and they saw 4 acres of cemetery and they said, aha, that's where we're going to expand. And they proposed to the community that they would disinter all 2,000 people buried in the cemetery and move them to another local burying ground. And there was community outrage. Not for the reason that all of us are now thinking, that we're desecrating the graves of our ancestors and what a sort of crime to move all those people from their final resting place, and what about their grave markers, and just all of those reasons were not what people in the community brought up. They were concerned that it was going to cost too much. So I think that sort of highlights the lack of understanding about the importance of the Marshfield Pioneer Cemetery to its community. And that was when I got involved, that was sort of what I saw as the problem. People find it difficult to go out there and mow the grass and take care of the weeds if they don't understand why they should care. It's not enough to know, oh, it's a cemetery, it's important. We really have to justify putting all that time and effort and money into preserving it. So we sometimes have to go the extra mile to show people that it's important. So I got involved 15 years ago as a high school student, as a freshman in high school, as a history project. And the one thing that had really survived in the cemetery, the one thing that the community was still doing, was marking the graves of the veterans at Veterans Day and Memorial Day. That was also the one time of year that the cemetery was generally open and unlocked. So I became involved with doing that, and it quickly morphed into doing a lot more. And we really started with needing to address physical infrastructure issues in the cemetery. It was terribly overgrown, practically inaccessible with overgrown blackberries and overgrown trees, and some of the headstones were completely buried. But right from the beginning, it was really important to me to find that sweet spot, that balance. So here we have the National Guard removing unsafe trees at one of our early work days. These trees had been originally planted as a hedge and then never maintained. And they had grown up and become a real hazard for visitors, but also for the great marble headstones, the beautiful 19th century marble headstones underneath them. So getting them out was a real hazard. Removing them was really important to get rid of that hazard. And it was also something that there was lots of people who wanted to come and make that clear, see that clear success from the standpoint that we were moving dump truck loads of debris from the cemetery. That was a really positive way that we've improved the cemetery. But at the same point, at those same work days, we needed to give other people who maybe didn't want to mow the grass or cut down trees, we needed to give them some options for participating and to encourage and further their interests. So for instance, here we have a high school student who's looking at some of our marble headstones, making transcriptions of the inscriptions on them, and documenting condition issues. And starting this process of gathering up all this data, which we'll talk about later, and which would really be critical 15 years later when I was starting to develop interpretive signage and other materials. So it's by starting to show high school students and other people that it's not just about mowing the grass, it's about so much more that we start to make progress. So unfortunately, we did a terrible job of documenting the cemetery before we started work, but here it is in 2008, vastly improved from how it had been 4 years earlier. But while the cemetery through the gates looks pretty decently maintained, you can see the headstones, the grass is mowed, we have a real problem with the entrance. I would use the word tacky to describe it. So we have an old rusting chain link fence and the fence even, it's hard to tell in this picture, but it has barbed wire along the top, not very inviting. The gate is locked with a padlock and it's only open usually twice a year, or if you want to access it, you have to check out a key and from the city hall or from the nearby principal's office at the high school. We have a new sign, which is that nice wooden green and gold sign, but that's really the only permanent interpretive materials there. You can see there's a black mailbox mounted on the fence. That is how we're displaying our brochures that we've created. And there's some other temporary signage that's been made at home on the laminator and just mounted on the fence. So lots of the result of a lot of work and a lot of positive things that happen. We'd had community work days in the cemetery. We had Memorial Day ceremonies there. We developed these walking tours that were available, done a lot of student programming, but we haven't created something that will endure, will last. I mean, the grass grows really fast, and without some permanent signage, it would be really easy for the cemetery to slip back to how it had been before I started my involvement. So we really needed to think about this all holistically in potentially developing a whole new entrance experience for the visitor. So in designing that entrance, there was a few things that we really needed to think about. So accessibility is a big one. The cemetery, as I've mentioned, was locked except on special occasions. So we needed to make it more accessible by eventually we switched the lock to a combination lock. So you could call and get the number even if you're standing right at the cemetery. But it was also because of its location and because of vandalism in the past, we still needed some security. We needed to have a way to lock it and we needed to have a fence to deter that sort of casual opportunistic vandalism. We're also located on the Oregon coast where it's very rainy and very windy at the top of a hill. So whatever materials we chose really needed to be appropriate for the site in a sense that we wanted things that weren't going to rust or wear out, needed to survive in a windy climate, and it really needed, the goal was to have something that would last 10+ years. And of course, as Curry mentioned, the cemetery is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's important that whatever we do be historically appropriate. Of course, the best historical antecedent would be, what did the cemetery have traditionally? Well, the cemetery didn't have a fence or gate until 1953 when they put up the chain link fence. So we had to think of other options. But ultimately, we went with the sort of picket style, black aluminum fencing, very typical in early 20th century America and seen in lots of other cemeteries. And of course, since the cemetery is right next to the high school, one of the big priorities was that there needed to be opportunities for student involvement. The students have caused some of the worst incidents of vandalism in the cemetery over the years and were generally instructed to keep out and sort of seen as seen that they could have no good influence on the cemetery. And our goal, starting the project as a high school student myself, was really to switch that mentality and have the students engaged in meaningful ways. The high school also has a manufacturing class that has the ability to do metalworking and other fabrication, so they could actually contribute to the project in many meaningful ways. And then from my perspective, the most important thing about designing a new entrance experience was that it needed to have obviously display space, place to put up permanent signage and temporary signage, and make it a much more inviting and less tacky entrance. So we went to a lot of cemeteries looking at lots of different examples. One of the problems is that the Marshfield Pioneer Cemetery, you can see a little bit in this picture, it doesn't really have space at the entrance to put some sort of kiosk or pavilion that's separate. There's the parking lot, and then you walk inside and the burial plots start immediately. So whatever we designed needed to be fairly flat. It needed to fit right in the fence line. So ultimately, after going to lots of cemeteries, we saw a really great example at Columbia Cemetery in Boulder, Colorado. And that would ultimately be our model. So here it is. It's a stainless wire mesh that then you can bolt various things onto. So very multi-purpose. You don't have to decide on something right when you're installing it. You can take things down, put things up as you need. So this project, which started out as maybe an interpretive panel and a gate, actually eventually expanded to redoing the entire western fence line of the cemetery, and as well as a gate and interpretive signage. So we embarked on a fairly major fundraising campaign to match a grant offered by the Oregon Commission on Historic Cemeteries with a lot of grassroots local fundraising. And we were really fortunate to get a lot of community support involvement. And our goal really was not to go out and ask donors to contribute lots of money, but to encourage that people that every dollar counts. Funding our fence inch by inch was our sort of campaign slogan. And it worked. And it was really successful in building community support for the project. So here we are in 2018. We have a new fence line along this property line of the cemetery. We have a new gate with its combination lock. We have a bollard that limits vehicle access except when specially designated. And we have these two great interpretive mesh screens, ready for putting interpretive materials on, that also include new signs. So you can see on the left, it says Marshfield Pioneer Cemetery, and on the right, it says IOOF, established 1888. And those signs were fabricated by the metalworking students that I mentioned a little earlier. So here we have this blank slate ready for interpretive materials. So by October of last year, we'd really finished the right-hand side. This was the side where we put a lot of our sort of permanent logistical materials, not really anything interpretive or fun, but we have a weatherproof locking bulletin board, so a cork board that you can mount things to. So that could be a sign about something going on in the area that's relevant, a program at the Historical Society. It could be student projects if we want to highlight student work in the cemetery, and that gives us an ability to change things out really easily without having to laminate things and make them weatherproof to last at the cemetery. This side also has our National Register of Historic Places plaque. It has a little sign about how to access the cemetery. It has a rules sign, which is really important because not only are there specific rules to the cemetery, but the cemetery is also managed as a unit of the Coos Bay City Parks Department today. So there are local ordinances that apply to all city parks. And then we also thought it was really important. Oregon is a great state that's very protective of its heritage and its cemetery. So we also listed the appropriate Oregon statutes that apply to historic cemeteries. And then you can see we have brightly colored metal mailboxes, waterproof metal mailboxes that have replaced our tacky black plastic mailbox. And these are, right now they hold brochures, one of which is about Civil War veterans in the cemetery, and the other one focuses on the region's maritime connections. And you can see we actually have some room left over to grow on this side as well. So the other side was still, as of October of last year, a blank slate ready for my creative design of some new permanent signage. So this is where, for me, the fun really starts, of thinking about how I want to tell the story of the cemetery in its myriad forms and making sure that we include the story of all 2,000 people who are buried there. So I realized pretty early on that the traditional outdoor kiosk signs that you see at places like national parks, at waysides, that really wasn't the model that was going to work well. There's nothing against these signs. They're great for their specific purposes, but it doesn't really work for the cemetery. They're better for specific locations, specific dates, specific things. It would be hard to tell the whole history of the cemetery in a few signs like this. So we can see this is a really typical one at the Coos History Museum. It's got a couple quotes, it's got some text, it's got 3 photos. It's very nicely designed, but not really going to work for us at the cemetery. We did learn one really useful thing from all of our consulting with and looking at local signs, is we figured out the substrate that we wanted to use. So the company that designed these was able to point us towards HPL, which is high pressure laminate, and which is right now one of the materials that's really preeminently used for outdoor signage. It has a lifespan of about 10 years, and it's really impervious to water. It's pretty resistant to vandalism, and it wipes off well. And it's nicer than a lot of old mediums, and it doesn't crack or get sort of that craze over the top. And it's really visible with graphics and bright colors and things. It's UV resistant as well, so it doesn't fade. And fortunately for us, there's about 10 companies in the US that do HPL work, and one of them is located in Santa Rosa, California. And that was actually ultimately who printed our signs for us. So lots of historic signage usually has lots of great historic pictures. But in the case of the cemetery, we were really limited. So for much of the time I worked with the cemetery, we had 2, seen here. These were the only 2 historic photos that we had, both taken in 1926 at a GAR state convention that was held in Coos Bay. But while they're interesting photos in their own right and have great historical importance, these do not make an interpretive panel. And over the years, some relatives and other people contributed other photos, none of which really had the creative hook I thought that would anchor our new interpretive materials. We needed to find other options than the text and photo traditional signage. So a little more thinking, and we landed on infographics. And right now, infographics are a really hot thing in the museum interpretation world, but also all over. So you've probably seen infographics without even realizing it. They're in print media and online and in advertising, and you name it, they've been everywhere. There've been a lot during the pandemic to talk about social distancing and the spread of the virus. And they're essentially any kind of graphic that often has some sort of element to show. Often has a graph itself or a chart, and really is designed to show information without being too text heavy. And it's all about sort of data visualization in a way that catches you and tells you something without having 100 words of text alongside of it. So once we landed on infographics, it became quite obvious that this was a great way to talk about cemeteries in general, because often cemeteries have a lot of information about many people, maybe not a lot of details about any one specific person, but lots of broad data that can be synthesized into an infographic. Some of that data includes things like the types of headstones. How did people die? What were the causes of death? Where were these people from? What were their occupations? How old were they? When were they buried? And all of this information can be showed really well in infographics. So with this as the jumping off point, I started working on some new signage. And here we have the signage proofs ready to go to the printer last fall. And here we have them as they look today installed at the cemetery. So now I really want to dig deep on this interpretive panels and talk about some of the things that I came up with and used, and hopefully give you some ideas if you're designing for a cemetery or other project, or just thinking about how to interpret historical data that will hopefully guide you. So the main component of the signage is a 6.5 foot long timeline that runs across of that left interpretive grid. And it's a 2-part timeline. So you can see across the top, we have history of the cemetery. So about 11 important dates in the cemetery's history. running from 1875, when the Independent Order of Oddfellows local lodge was established, to 1944, when the city took ownership of the cemetery. And then the bottom has about 14 dates in local history. And although earlier I was saying that historic photos weren't necessarily the solution for doing the materials at the cemetery, this turned out to be a great way to incorporate some photos from the collection of the Coos History Museum. So it was a really good way to showcase relevant photos. So as I started designing this, one of the things that I wanted to keep in mind was that just like the design of the fence and the gate itself, the signage needed to be consistent with the historic nature of the cemetery. And that meant thinking about the fonts I use, the icons, the details, and ultimately I realized that where better to look than the cemetery itself. So here you can see that the icon that I use on the timeline for the cemetery half is actually sort of a stylized version, the same shape as government issue headstones. Same with the cartouche that holds the date. It's the same style that I adapted from the headstone of a woman named Sophie Carlson, buried in the cemetery. So I started looking at all these elements and graphics and figuring out ways that I could include them. The average visitor will not necessarily realize that there are all these sort of homages to the cemetery included, but it was a fun thing to do. And it also sort of gives that overall sense of it being appropriate at the historic site. So as I mentioned, the top half has dates important to cemetery history, like when the cemetery was first established, and then later on in its history, dates that relate to how it interacts with other things. For instance, in 1909, they sold property to the local school district that led to the construction of the high school, which is something everyone asks about. So this really addresses those big questions about, tell us the history of the cemetery in a very text-light way. Being an infographic, I had to get some graphs and charts in, and I have lots of that data at my fingertips thanks to 15 years of working on a database. So the cemetery has an access database that I've built over the years that has entries for all 1,958 people buried there. It has room for, it can continually expand, but has room for a lot of the common information that we would acquire. Where were they from? Who were they married to? Parents? When did they die? What did they die of? Who bought the plot? If they're veterans, there's information for that. There's fields for that. And this is all kept in this database. We're looking right now at sort of a form, for the main form for what it shows for one person. So we could click through and see all the different forms. So all this information is great, but not necessarily compelling unless we can use it in a new and an exciting way. And that's what we really found that we could do with the infographic. So I took all that knowledge of what years people died in and could create a graph that shows burials per year from 1888 to 1944. We see that in 1909, the cemetery has the peak number of burials, stays pretty consistent through 1916, and then it really drops off. Now we could have just used this as part of our signage, but it would need an explanation, a caption, it would need more text, and maybe it wouldn't be necessarily engaging to every visitor. However, if we integrate it right into the timeline, it becomes sort of a little bit in the background, but it's something that the visitor who's curious can really dig deeper and learn a little bit more. So we see there again is our peak in 1909, stays pretty consistent. And then 1916 isn't even on the timeline, but we can still see that it falls right there between our dates of 1915 and 1918. So on the bottom half of the timeline, that was really an opportunity to pick about, as I mentioned, 14 dates in local history that connect back to the cemetery in some way. These are all important events in local history in their own right, but I wanted there to be a way that if someone's at the cemetery gate giving an impromptu tour, they can point to these things and they can go further. They can be talking points to expand upon for the interested visitor. So for instance, in 1894, an important local coal mine, the Beaver Hill coal mine, was established. And we have here a photo of some miners, but we also have coal miners buried in the cemetery. So here is the Bryn family monument, a group of Welsh coal miners who had moved to the area and worked in the coal mines. Now, this is a sort of a sad example. This headstone was badly damaged in a round of vandalism in 2008, but the family was able to get it restored when we had a noted headstone repairer in the area in 2008 as well. So lots of other things on the timeline connect as well. Lumber baron Asa Simpson, who ran the Simpson Lumber Company out of Coos Bay, and Coos Bay was one of the larger shipbuilding points in the 19th century on the Oregon coast. And that one of the major shipbuilders, John Cruz, as well as many of the rank and file people who worked in the shipyards, are all buried in the cemetery as well. This timeline was also a place to highlight some of the things that had been overlooked. For instance, Duluth Jackson, who was the last hereditary chief of the Coos Indians, was buried in the cemetery in 1907, but never had a headstone. The Confederated tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw arranged for him to have a headstone and had it installed within the last decade. And when it came time to do this part of the timeline, that was an opportunity to interact, to ask them, what do they want the timeline to say? How would they like his importance to the area and his history acknowledged? So it was great to collaborate and make sure that we tell stories the way all of our community partners want them told. So here we have his grave with his new headstone and some local high school students who were helping to plant native plants on the grave. Again, there are other parts of the cemetery's history that were easy to overlook because the graves weren't marked with headstones. And the wreck of the Tsarina is a perfect example. In 1910, 23 people died when the Tsarina wrecked on the Coos Bay Bar, and it was the worst loss of life in the area. And most of the bodies were not discovered, but about 10 washed ashore over the ensuing weeks, many of which could never be concretely identified. And they were all buried in several unmarked graves in a corner of the cemetery, listed as unknown in the cemetery logbooks. We were fortunate to have the Coast Guard aids to navigation team doing a lot of work in the cemetery, and they became really engaged and involved. And this was a story that really resonated with them because of their work, making sure that it's possible to navigate the Coos Bay Bar and the bay. So they wanted to recognize this part of our history and actually got a small grant and have built a small monument with a plaque that recognizes the victims of the Tsarina and the importance of these maritime connections in the region. So all of those things on the timeline are those great talking points that the average visitor may only read 5 things on the timeline, but hopefully 1 or 2 of them will resonate. And it also provides that opportunity for further exploration for those who are interested and engaged. So below the timeline, we have 3 they're 24-inch by 24-inch infographics. They have a lot of different things going on them, but one of the goals with them was to sort of highlight some of the major themes important to the cemetery. So several years earlier, I had written the National Register nomination for the cemetery, and that proved to be a really useful experience in the sense that I'd synthesize why is the cemetery historically significant to local and regional history. Of course, I'd done it in 8,000 words, which certainly isn't going to fit on a text panel, but it had given us those big talking points, major themes to then drill down and highlight them on the interpretive panels, albeit in a very different way than in a text-heavy academic National Register nomination. So perhaps the most important thing about the Marshall Pioneer Cemetery is that it represents the diversity of the region in the early 20th century. That Coos Bay was a port that attracted people from across the US and around the globe. And that's a story that we don't often think of today when we often view Coos Bay as a bit of a backwater without good air connections and certainly not nearly as good of port or rail connections as it once had in the early 20th century. So the top half of this panel really focuses on some of those international immigrants who came to the region, often drawn by the natural resources or the potential of jobs. So again, I have that database of burials that tells me information about what was originally called in the logbook their nativity, where they're born. And I was able to use that to synthesize these what's called a bubble chart showing the proportions of what countries. Now, like many other things with the infographics, there was a lot of data mining and data cleaning that had to be done. We had a lot of people who were from Prussia, and we had to make decisions like, do we show Prussia as Prussia on our bubble chart, or do we sort of turn it into contemporary Germany? Poland actually shows up here, but if you look in the original logbook, nobody says they're from Poland. They were from Prussia or from Russia, depending on the way Poland had been divvied up at the early 20th century. So some decisions were made to standardize this for a 21st century audience. But one of the things that I love about this is that you can look at it, you don't have to read anything, you don't have to really look in a lot of detail, and you can see that the most people most international immigrants who are buried in the cemetery came from Finland, and then second most is Great Britain, and then Sweden, and then Germany and Ireland, and you can really get a sense of where people are from without needing to read 150 words about it. We also sometimes wanted to find ways of using fun graphics, staying away from lots of black and white photos, using them sparingly as needed, but also having some other visual elements. So we were sort of playing around and ended up with this postmark that ended up being a fun way of showing that what countries were the various people, the 4 people that we highlight on the top of this infographic. Where were they from and what year did they arrive in the US? So a great way of showing that without having to write some sentences, that Louisa Hearst was born in Australia and immigrated to the United States in 1859. So again, little things that not every visitor may notice or point out, but are all there for them to look at. So it was really important to tell the story of all 2,000 people in the cemetery, but obviously we couldn't have a notebook with 2,000 people for the people to flip through at the gate. That wouldn't work, and choices had to be made. But it was really important to me that we not fall into that trap of using people who we might have the best photos of, who would generally be the upper middle class white men who are important in local history. So really looking for alternatives, people who, women, minorities, people who are working class. How do we tell their stories and make sure we're telling this diverse, inclusive narrative? It was also a little bit self-serving that we wanted to tell some stories that address common questions we're asked. And perhaps the #1 question ever asked at the Marshwood Pioneer Cemetery is, what is that little house in the middle of the cemetery? Oops, I was also going to mention that these blurbs ended up being fairly short, only about 75 words. And you can really write, even if you don't know much about the person, you can certainly write 75 words. So back to the little house in the middle of the cemetery, it's actually the Hearst Mausoleum, which is the only above ground crypt in the cemetery. And Louisa Hearst, the woman whose picture we just saw, she had it commissioned after the death of her husband. So this is a great way. People might be out wandering in the cemetery and we can point out, oh, make sure you stop by and look at Louisa Hearst's photo and learn a little bit about her history and how she came from Australia to the Coos Bay region. So some of the other stories we ended up telling were only really possible because we developed great relationships with relatives who have wonderful materials that they could share. In the case of Peter Claussen, his relatives were very supportive of him being one of our featured people. He's a great example because he's another immigrant from Germany, and he had a diverse life experience. He started off as working as a skilled carpenter, and then later an accident forced him to retire from that and become a shoe salesman running a local shoe store. It's also nice to highlight contemporary connections. So we have on the left a photo of the Claussen house, which Peter built with all the skills he had as a shipbuilder. And then we have a contemporary photo. So the house still stands and it's quite close to the cemetery. So you can drive by, see some of our historic districts and historic buildings in downtown Coos Bay, and connect the cemetery to broader trends in local history. And there's another great story that I really like to tell about Peter, because it sort of highlights how a lot of women tended to be overlooked. So there were a number of women who outlived their husbands who are buried in the cemetery, but because they were the ones to die second, their names never made it onto their joint headstones. So Myrta Claussen, Peter's wife, actually outlives him by about 50 years. There's plenty of room on the headstone for her name, and she is buried there, but it was never inscribed with her name. And this bothered me, and it bothered their family. So their great grandson Don Claussen actually was a great supporter and contributor to our projects and arranged for her name to be added to the monument and the monument to be reset back to its proper location. And we're really lucky that Don has since passed away, but he got to see his ancestor recognized on our interpretive materials before he passed. So the bottom half of this infographic panel does a similar thing looking at people in the cemetery who came from other parts of the United States. So similarly, it's anchored by a graph in the middle with shading that shows what percentages of people came from other states. We can see a lot from California, Missouri, Pennsylvania, New York. One of our goals was really to avoid that trope that everyone in Oregon got here by the Oregon Trail. So instead, we're highlighting 7 ways that people got to Coos Bay. One of them is the Oregon Trail, but not the only way. So for instance, a lot of people were veterans who were potentially disabled or looking for a more hospitable climate after the Civil War, and Coos Bay seemed like a great place to move to. Again, we want to have sort of these archetypal narratives without getting bound up with a particular photo or a particular person. So we went with these great 19th century and early 20th century clip art. So it's all public domain clip art that's actually made available online through the University of Florida. So in each of these cases, although it is this archetypal narrative about how someone got to the region, it also connects to specific individuals. So for instance, one of those veterans who traveled out to Oregon for health reasons was Morton Tower, a major in the Civil War who escaped from Libby prison after the Battle of Gettysburg. He was imprisoned in Richmond, tunneled out. So a really amazing, great story that's really fascinating to a lot of our younger visitors. And this is, again, something that if you're standing at the timeline and in front of the panel telling that story, you can highlight this and suggest, why don't you go down to the correct plot and view Morton Tower's grave? Again, back to sort of the family connections, I mentioned earlier, John Cruz, lots of shipbuilders in the area, lots of sea captains who come to the region because it's a bay. And sometimes you meet people in the strangest places. So we were actually at the groundbreaking for the new Coos History Museum back in the early 20-teens when we met Martha Butler and her granddaughters, who are actually descendants of a man named Parker Butler, who was an important local sea captain. Now, this is a great example of someone who's not buried in the cemetery. So Parker Butler's name is on that gravestone, but he was lost at sea. So this is a cenotaph in his honor. And because there was a lot of maritime accidents in the area, it's not the only cenotaph in the cemetery. Another great story that we like to talk about is all the Scandinavian loggers, many of whom sort of stopped off in the Great Lakes region, or maybe were born in the US and then sort of moved west, but maybe had Scandinavian ancestry and had worked in logging operations in various areas of the country. And a great story on that front is John Rylander, who was from Pennsylvania and who moved west and wrote to his wife and asked her to come out and join him in Oregon, and she chose not to. She stayed in Pennsylvania with her children. But unfortunately, John Rylander died in a logging accident not long after arriving in the area, was buried in an unmarked grave. And it wasn't until 2015 that we connected with a great nephew of his who was really interested in honoring his great uncle and arranged for him to have a new headstone in the cemetery. So the second infographic goes a completely different direction. We really wanted to talk about the Oddfellows and their importance. A lot of people don't really think about the independent order of Oddfellows these days. In fact, people often call the cemetery looking to rent an apartment because the local Oddfellows Hall has apartments in it. But there is no active Oddfellows group in the Bay Area anymore, and it's not something people necessarily think of. But we want people to maybe, if they're visiting, think about how does this connect to their own community. So there's about 116 Oddfellows cemeteries in Oregon. So perhaps the visitor can look on our map of Oregon counties, think about where they're from, and then be intrigued to go home and research what are the Oddfellows cemeteries in their county, and maybe do a little bit more research into their local history. We do have some of that traditional text photo caption signage as part of the infographic. So it was important to tell that narrative about who the Oddfellows are and why they were so invested in providing that community service of a public burying ground. So we do have about 150 words about the Oddfellows, but it's still not too much text. And when I was picking historic photos, it was really fun to pick this photo, which doesn't show the Oddfellows in street clothes. It doesn't show a building that they built or maybe them at the cemetery. It's this really bizarre photo of them in their ceremonial regalia. And part of the goal is maybe those students or that casual visitor who's come to the high school for a basketball tournament, they're walking by and suddenly they're intrigued by, what are those crazy, why are those men dressed like that? And stop and really take a second look and take 5 minutes to read that panel. So my training is as a public historian, and right now I'm a collections manager and archivist. So I love actual historical materials, and a lot of archival documents never really get to see the light of day. They're often in libraries and archives where they're well preserved, but the average visitor just isn't going to see them. So I wanted to include some of that as well. So here we have a historic deed from the cemetery. So when you bought a plot, you would get a deed saying that you are the owner of however many plots you bought and what you paid for it. So this is a scan of one of the cemetery deeds. And the same with the cemetery's historic logbooks. So until relatively recently, if you went to the city of Coos Bay and you went to their desk and you said, I'm looking for someone in the cemetery, their response would be to go to the vault, pull out their logbook, and hand it over to you to flip through. Now, that's not really good for a 140-year-old book. And we've really tried to wean them off of that and use the modern computerized database that has a lot more accurate information. But people really want to know, how were these records kept? So by including a scan of the logbook, it can really spark conversations with some of our young visitors about historic handwriting. People were writing this in illegible cursive. How did people know what they were writing about? Some people were really off on their names and had accents and their names got spelled wrong, or where they were from is completely different than what we know where they were actually from. So all of this information can be that great conversation piece to go further and talk about other topics. But mostly on the bottom half of this infographic, it was really designed to talk about causes of death and how people died. So we see here that we have consumption, old age, drown, stomach trouble, consumption again, old age. So a lot of repeating causes of death, but a lot of esoteric ones. We wouldn't say today that someone died of consumption. We would say they died of tuberculosis. So I really wanted to look at cleaning up all that data, synthesizing it into modern causes of death, and figuring out what were the top causes of death of people in the cemetery in the late 19th and early 20th century. Part of that was trying to dispel this long-standing myth about, we often say, death by petticoat, that women died from their skirts catching on fire or from childbirth. And while those were ways that people did die, we wanted to look at what actually happened. What does the data tell us? And we learned that tuberculosis was the most common cause of death in the 19th century for people buried in the cemetery. And here we show that in another infographic form with a radial bar graph, which is just a bar graph that goes in a circle. So it's kind of fun. And for the sixth most common cause of death in the cemetery, it's actually pneumonia. But many of those 71 people who died of pneumonia caught it as a result of complications from influenza during the 1918 influenza pandemic. So as I started working on this in the middle of our current pandemic, it proved a really timely topic that we can point to and talk about those people who died during the last pandemic, including a young gentleman who was a World War I veteran and who died in service while he was waiting for a discharge. This is sort of my example of you never know where you're going to find things, because we did not have a photo of Eric Anderson, but at the state archives, they have letters that his father wrote and those photos, because the state librarian in the 1920s wrote to veterans and veterans' families, Gold Star families, and collected all this material that is at the state archives that we would never have known about, except that they were doing a little online exhibit to commemorate the World War I centenary. So you really have to spread your net wide, because you really do never know where you're going to find that fascinating document that relates back to your topic or your cemetery. And then on the bottom, we went back to the obituaries of some of the people who were buried in the cemetery, which have been really useful, wonderful documents. So I sort of took some of the newspaper reproductions that we had, taken from newspapers.com and from reading lots of microfilm at the local library, and cleaned them up and turned them into my own versions of newspaper headlines, which often were, we went for a little bit more of the yellow journalism sensational headlines, which I hope, again, might intrigue some people who are just passing by. So the last panel and the last infographic really gets down to the headstones themselves and looks at some of those broad trends in the cemetery and hopes to answer some of those big picture questions that people always want to know about. How many people? When were the most burials? How many people moved out of the cemetery? How many plots are still available? And this was a chance to address all of those questions. And again, I went back to the cemetery itself as inspiration. So there's a lot of doves on 19th century headstones. It's a wonderful symbol in Victorian iconography. And I shamelessly appropriated it for the idea that when people are moving to other cemeteries, they're flying away. So our icon was taken right from an actual headstone in the cemetery. The same with the shaking hands, sort of, to me, representative of a business transaction, and maybe if you're purchasing a plot. So I could use that same headstone to highlight how many vacancies there were in the cemetery. There's only actually about 50 plots that were never sold. So it's essentially a full cemetery. And then for this bar graph that shows what percentage of people were born in Oregon or foreign countries and their birthplace, I actually returned to a monument we saw earlier. This is that same monument of the Welsh coal miners that was being restored in that first image I showed. But a beautiful, very typical of many of the sort of obelisk style monuments in the cemetery with an urn on top. And then here again, we have very simple bar graph, but instead of doing it with just colored charts, colored lines, we've turned it into headstones. So here we are showing the ages of people who are buried in the cemetery. Really noticeable that 13% of people buried in the cemetery are infants under the age of 1 year. So a high percentage of infant mortality. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you can see that lots of people live to be more than 70 years of age. And then right from the beginning, from that one of those very first photos that I showed of that young woman gathering information about the headstone and the condition, all of that information came into play when we started working on the infographics as well. So here we have sort of concentric circles that show what percentages of headstones are made out of different materials. So we can see that 65% are marble, and our circle is so large, it's larger than our 24-inch page, but then only 2% are black granite. So it's a little tiny circle. And hopefully all of this gives people a sense of scale and helps them, whether they're a visual learner or like to read or like experiential learning, all of these different styles of materials included on the same infographic will hopefully help different learners who are interested in different things be engaged. And then the bottom half of this infographic was actually the very last thing I designed, and we sort of got stuck on it. It's hard when you only have a limited amount of space. What do you want to talk about? And ultimately, we decided that this was where we needed to look at all these names that are associated with people buried in the cemetery, that you might be driving down Anderson Avenue and never realize who it was named for. So I shamelessly stole from the local newspaper in the early 20th century, which had a social column called People You Know, and turned it into People You Should Know, and highlighted a few people in the cemetery who are the namesakes of local destinations. So I already mentioned street signs. So all the avenues in Coos Bay are named for local people who were around when they renamed them in the 1940s, I believe, or who had passed away. Many had passed away, but had been important in the early 20th century. And two of those, Edmund Anderson and Charles Johnson, are both buried in the cemetery. So again, here, rather than just using a photo of them with black and white, portrait, not particularly exciting, by putting the street sign, hopefully it makes people connect. Oh, that's local street in Coos Bay, and the next time I'm driving down Johnson, I might think about who that person is and where they're buried. And then some places that are destinations. For instance, Golden Falls is a Oregon State Park, and many people visit it annually, and many local residents know it. But fewer of them probably realize that Glen Creek, which is the creek that flows over the falls, is named for a Civil War veteran who first homesteaded on the creek. Now, I didn't have photos or any kind of documentation. I didn't have the patent deed from William Glen's land claim, but I'm good with Photoshop and could find an equivalent deed from the Oregon State Archives, a little bit of erasing and a little bit of cursive handwriting font, and we have created our own deed, patent deed for WWR Glen's land claim. So using that as the backdrop makes it a little more visually interesting than just having a paragraph of text about this this faceless Civil War veteran. And then for a second graphic icon for him, we also had that lovely GAR medallion. So the fraternal group for Civil War veterans who served on the Union side is the Grand Army of the Republic. And this would have been a medal that he might have worn or owned, or certainly would have been familiar with. So that's sort of been a whirlwind tour of the three infographics and the timeline panel. And I know we've covered a lot of information in a really short time, but really throughout the whole process, my goal was to present material in a diverse set of ways. So it's really busy in a way. It has lots of different elements that I hope are appealing to people today who often have very short attention spans and are used to thinking in the scale of like Twitter, which only has 140 characters per post. And that was really a fun and new way of designing for me to look at it through that lens. So I'd be remiss if I don't end with thanking the many, many partners. Lots of local people have contributed in so many ways to our many projects over the last 15 years. But the new signage itself was actually supported through a grant from Travel Oregon. And then of course, we've had ongoing support from the city of Coos Bay, the Coos Cultural Coalition, which has given us other grants, and the Oregon Commission on Historic Cemeteries and the Oregon State Parks. So all of those institutions have made our work possible. So at this point, I'd love to open it up to questions and discussion, and hopefully some of you might have comments or feedback or want to talk more about any aspects of this project. So as Curry mentioned, I think we'll be able to, we're a small enough group that people can use the raise hand icon or type their questions as they wish. So I see, I'm going to go sort of left to right as I see people. So I see that Cheryl has her hand raised. So if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Fabulous. The infographics are great. I do have a question about, you know, I have seen a lot of other plaques like you had shown pictures of around state parks and things. And after a while, they just degrade with the weather and the salt and all that kind of stuff. And you mentioned that you thought that this would last about 10 years. And then, do you have a plan of what happens in 10 years? Is there another you going to follow along in 10 years and update and upgrade things?
So sort of as an aside, the joke was that we're continually updating the data, and my mother is often my partner in crime who is still in Coos Bay and does a lot of on-site research and loves looking up obituaries and things. So even before the signage got back from the printer, our percentages of what people died of was already slightly inaccurate due to additional data which had turned up. So certainly I think in 10 years, our learning styles may have changed. We may have great new information to share. I'd love to imagine that there are more students who will get involved and do new materials, but I do hope that the signage has a 10-year warranty, so it should at least last that long. And hopefully at that point, there will be other people who step up, or if need be, some of for instance, the timeline could certainly be reprinted as needed. But I think, unfortunately, nothing lasts forever, and we need to continually updating things to be relevant. Certainly signage that would have been done 20 years ago often seems really outdated now. So, but I think great point about having to think long-term.
Thank you.
So Kayla is next on my screen, so I'm going to ask you to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. It was really great. I particularly want to comment on, it's crazy impressive to me that you've been basically championing this for 15 years. That's a cool energy that usually I work in historical consulting, so I'm used to working with folks who have done that, but don't have the professional expertise to sort of carry it through. But it's cool that you kind of were one-stop shopping for that project. What I'm wondering is if you would be willing to share either your presentation or like the actual infographics from the slides. I'd love to explore them kind of at leisure and read some of the text.
Yeah, sure. So the presentation is definitely has been recorded, and actually there's a similar one that was more focused on the history for those of you who are interested in learning more about the history that I did back in last October for the Coos History Museum. But if you want to send me a chat with your email address, I'd be happy to share the graphics.
Thank you so much.
I also do appreciate your comment about sort of me staying involved for this long. And I think it is worth pointing out that our grant from Travel Oregon was pretty small. It was about $2,400 and funded a lot of the sort of physical things on the right side. So the new bulletin board and the mailboxes and all that, and also paid for all the printing of the signage, which we could have never afforded all of that if we had to pay for both the research and the design. So my professional career is as a museum person, and I work at a museum and have design experience, so I can do all that in-house, which of course makes all the difference from a financial standpoint. So Karen, you're next. So if you want to mute and ask your question.
There we go. You are incredible. You're doing everything I'm trying to do, unfortunately, for a much larger cemetery. Mountain View Cemetery, Oregon City. What we call our historic cemetery started in 1848, but we have a Masonic and an Oddfellows section that were originally sold to the two lodges for burials for their members. And in the 1970s, they were transferred to the city because our cemetery is a city park and is actually still an active cemetery and is huge. And there's nothing that designates where the Masonic cemetery starts, where the Oddfellows cemetery starts, and the history of those two lodges, which are interesting because we had the first Masonic lodge and the third Oddfellows lodge. It should have been the first, but they landed in Hawaii with the charter, and the Hawaiians talked them into giving them the charter for lodge number one. This would be, your infographics and other information would be wonderful to add to our space. Thank you. You are an inspiration. I am impressed with everything you have done. And I am also interested in getting a recording of this because we have other staff members I'd love to have watch this.
Sure. And I'm certainly, I'll put my contact information in the chat, and anyone who wants to get in touch with me after this, I'm always happy to talk cemetery and share what I know. It's a lot of it developed over time with lots of trial and error, so feel free to reach out. I do have to make a slight detour and ask, is Mountain View the oldest city-owned cemetery in Oregon?
As far as I have been able to determine, we appear actually in the entire Oregon territory. There is documentation from the old Oregon City Argus that it was designated the city cemetery in 1848, which literally makes it the oldest city cemetery in the entire territory.
So I have to tell a quick anecdote. I mentioned that our timeline stops in 1944 when the city, I think I used the words acquires ownership, but the city did not actually acquire ownership. They failed to file the correct paperwork. So today the city, although the nominal property owner technically does not own the cemetery. And in 1945, they actually, when they're sort of discussing should they acquire the cemetery and take ownership of it, they have this big brouhaha over the fact that they don't think Oregon municipalities can run a cemetery, and they think it would be illegal to spend municipal funds on maintaining a cemetery. And while I was researching this, I ended up looking at Mountain View and was like, but there have been city-owned cemeteries for hundreds of years at that point. But they actually, the Coos Bay representatives, they actually go to their local representatives and the senators and get state legislation passed that makes it legal for municipalities to spend money maintaining cemeteries, but still
Well,
never
and-
been able to follow the appropriate paperwork.
You could also find 3 different dates for the founding of Mountain View. According to the newspaper article, it's 1848. According to the city commission minutes, oops, they forgot to pay the Holmes family for the property in 1852, talked about it, and oops, they forgot about it until 1856 when they finally paid, I think, $5 for the original cemetery. But we do know from the gravedigger who was not happy that we'd started a cemetery so far outside of town that it had been designated the city cemetery in 1848.
Mhm.
So pick a date, any date, but we're still back into the 1850s.
Thank you.
Becky, I wanted to pipe in and say, if you send me the document of the images, then
Yeah.
I can email it to the registration list, and that way you don't have to, I mean, people can talk to you more directly, more specifically, but if they just want that, I'm happy to distribute that. So.
Sure, I will definitely do that. And I'll send them as PDF, so please feel free to use them as reference materials or share them. Just please credit them that they're courtesy of the Marshfield Pioneer Cemetery. So did I miss any questions that people were asking?
It looks like
I do have one more question. I was out wandering around yesterday in Lynn County, and there was a sign that I'd never seen before on a cemetery, on the Baptist Cemetery. It said Oregon Historic Cemetery, Oregon Commission on Historic Cemeteries. So is that part of the group that you are? Is that part of the Oregon Heritage?
Right.
So
Or is that something else?
was it like a light greenish sign?
Yeah, more kind of blue, and it had like the state logo on it.
So
Yeah.
that sign should be on our panel, but there was it needed to come down because we had to rearrange a few things. So I'll let Curry speak to that, but that will actually be also on the right-hand side panel at our cemetery as well.
So
this-
that's
so
your
this-
umbrella.
So the state of Oregon has a historic cemetery designation in the Oregon Commission on Historic Cemeteries. I'm the coordinator for that commission. We're part of Oregon Heritage, which includes the State Historic Preservation Office and the Oregon Heritage Commission. And we are part of Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, which is a state agency.
Okay.
I also see a question, which I think is a prompt from my family members about, is there a map of the people buried in the cemetery, which I failed to mention. But one of the late additions to the signage was actually having a map. I've sort of drawn a fancy map that shows where everyone's buried and color codes their grave by what kind of material their headstone is, and shows the cemetery has a lot of curbing, which is fairly unique in Oregon cemeteries. It didn't get pulled out for ease of maintenance. So this is actually mounted on the back side. So if you're standing in the cemetery on the back of the one interpretive panel, you can look at a map of everyone who's buried there. So.
All right, well, not seeing any more. There's cross communication happening, but I don't think there are any further questions. So thanks so much, Becky. This was really exciting to see this approach. And I'm a huge fan of infographics when they're actually graphic depictions, not just giant letters. So that was really cool to see, and how you can kind of tuck them into the background too, as you did with the timeline. So really, it's kind of inspiring to sort of sit with the information that you can get and sort of explore the information you can get to tell. I like how you talked about telling that whole broad picture in not very much space, and that's a big challenge, but I kind of want to go do this everywhere now, so it's pretty cool. I did, yeah, you mentioned grants and I talked about grants in the chat. We do have, Oregon Commission on Historic Cemeteries has an annual grant program. The applications open in January and they have a spring deadline. So this is definitely work that can be funded with our grant program. And thanks everybody for coming tonight. I'm glad that you all appreciated what you saw here, and yeah, thanks for your time, Becky, and volunteering. I'm grateful that you mentioned it, and thanks to Cricket for sharing our desire to have some programming around cemeteries again after a year and a half of not. So I appreciate it. And I hope so I will get that information from Becky, and I will email people based on the registration. And thanks so much, everybody. Have a good evening.
And thank you to Curry and Becky from Karen.